We all know that life in the ancient world was challenging. But what if those challenges weren't just big battles or grand epics? What if they were the tiny, daily miseries, like the constant itch of pests or the crushing weight of owning only one shirt? Imagine waking up on a thin mat, every joint aching against the damp clay floor, instantly bombarded by the clash of Roman armor and the bray of a donkey. In today's video, why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Jerusalem, we'll take you through the first brutal moments of a day defined by scarcity, danger, and the constant battle for survival. Let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The first harsh light of the Judean dawn, not a gentle glow, but a sudden, uncompromising yellow blaze, penetrates the single, small window of your dwelling, signaling the non-negotiable end to your troubled, few hours of rest. A demanding chorus, Roman armor clang, rooster crow, donkey bray, shatters the pre-dawn quiet, instantly dragging your mind back to the volatile, relentless reality of daily life in ancient Jerusalem. You awaken upon a thin mat woven from coarse reeds and dried straw, its unforgiving texture having etched its pattern onto your skin, leaving every joint stiff and aching against the cold, damp clay floor. The air hanging heavy in the small, shared room is dense with the mingled scents of stale lamp oil, dry sweat, and the constant, thick, earthy smell of the packed dirt and simple clay that forms the structure of your ancient home. Personal space is a forgotten luxury, forcing you to shift carefully to avoid nudging your spouse or the huddled forms of your children, all packed tightly within the cramped few square meters of shared domestic refuge. Upon attempting to rise, a low, familiar ache throbs in your back and knees, a chronic pain earned from years of hauling and squatting, which you instantly accept as the standard, inescapable baseline of your daily existence. There is no time for reflection or resentment, only an immediate pressure driven by spiritual duty and the cold necessity of being the first to rise and face the daunting demands of the coming day. Your first act is the ritual washing of hands with the meager amount of water kept overnight in an earthenware jug, symbolically cleansing yourself of the night's impurities before daring to address the Creator. As you perform this solemn duty, the gravity of the Roman presence, the fragility of the peace, and the constant threat of violence settle upon you like the fine, invisible dust filtering down from the ceiling. The first wave of sensory overload comes as the heavy wooden door opens slightly, allowing the city's sudden cacophony, shouts, cries, and the scrape of stone to flood the small room and quicken your weary heart. You pull your focus away from the physical discomfort to prepare for the most crucial spiritual task, settling into a posture of deep reverence for the traditional public pronouncement of the holy name. Your lips begin to move, shaping the eternal words of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. An absolute declaration of faith that grounds you against the unstable chaos outside your walls. The stark contrast between the lofty devotion of the Shema and the tangible grime of your surroundings is intense. Your soul is lifted to the heavens, even as your feet remain planted firmly on the unswept floor. The sparse furnishings, a few clay pots, a low chest, and rolled bedding, are purely functional, serving only the most basic needs of storage, cooking, and sleeping in this tiny, shared space. with no room for extras. Even as you pray, the maddening distraction of persistent pests continues. The residual itch of flea and louse bites serves as a bitter reminder that your body constantly battles the miniature denizens of your living quarters. The single, rough-spun wool tunic is your protection and identity, and you wrap the mantle tighter around yourself against the persistent chill of the desert morning. Inhaling deeply, the stagnant air is instantly replaced by the acrid wood smoke from neighbors' cooking fires, mingling ominously with the distinct, sweet stench of exposed refuse from the alleys outside. An intense, dry craving grips your throat, an inescapable thirst that speaks of the arid climate and the difficulty of retaining moisture, instantly establishing your most critical, compelling physical need for the day. The day's survival schedule dictates that you cannot afford another moment of rest, knowing that the best resources, especially the limited public water supply, belong only to those who rise and move earliest. The rest of your family stirs, their small, rustling movements communicating the complete, silent dependence of the entire household upon your personal provision and strength. You meticulously navigate the dark corners of the room, keenly aware of the severe risk of stumbling and breaking a precious piece of earthenware, an accident that could cost you many days of saving. A quiet, internal resolve hardens your expression. You will endure the hunger, the heat, and the Romans because failure is unthinkable and would certainly result in the shame and suffering of your entire kin. The final blessing concludes, leaving your soul spiritually prepared and strengthened. Yet your body remains vulnerable to the raw, harsh demands of the material life you must now inhabit. The urgency of the morning crystallizes into a single, overriding imperative: the need to acquire the essential liquid that keeps your body functioning in this ancient metropolis, the vital, finite, precious water supply. Driven by this fundamental requirement, you lift the heavy, empty water skins, turn your back on the small comfort of the cramped room, and step through the low doorway, ready to face the dangerous scramble that awaits you in the crowded streets. The moment you step from the dark, intimate safety of your home, the weight of the empty leather water skins and the ceramic jugs immediately begins to chafe against your shoulder, an early reminder that survival here is measured in raw, physical effort. The alleyways leading away from your dwelling are narrow, cold funnels of rough-hewn stone, already slick with the overnight condensation and the inevitable runoff from poorly maintained household drains. You move quickly, but cautiously, your bare feet or flimsy leather sandals carefully avoiding the larger pools of stagnant liquid that congregate in the deepest depressions of the unpaved path, knowing that every puddle is a biological landmine. The race for water is a silent, communal desperation played out in the half-light as you join a scattering of other figures, mostly women and older children, all shuffling toward the public cisterns or the main aqueduct feeder with identical expressions of weary urgency. You know that arriving late means not only a longer wait, but a less desirable, muddier dregs of the precious liquid, making the silent competition fierce and unforgiving in its necessity. The primary water source, whether a public cistern or a segment of the massive aqueduct system designed by Herod, is a monumental feature carved into the rock. Yet its beauty is entirely negated by the foul, humid air that rises from its depths. As you approach, the noise intensifies. The dull, rhythmic clanking of bucket against stone, the low grunts of those pulling heavy loads, and the sharp, territorial chatter of those guarding their place in line. The sheer physical commitment to drawing water is draining. You must carefully drop your rope and bucket down what feels like an endless shaft, the heavy leather cutting into your hands as you brace yourself to haul the dense, resisting weight of the full vessel back up against gravity. The liquid you finally pull forth is rarely clear. It is often murky, possessing a faint greenish or brownish tint, carrying a metallic or slightly sweet taste that is less refreshing and more unsettling. You look closely at the bucket's contents, mentally cataloging any floating debris, perhaps a stray leaf, a bit of mud, or disturbingly, the faint, decomposing form of an insect or small rodent that met its end in the unseen depths below. This contamination is the price of life in a dense, unsanitary city. Every mouthful of water, every sip of refreshment is a roll of the biological dice, and you recognize that the source of life is also the great bringer of death. You have seen neighbors succumb to the sudden, violent illness that sweeps through the summer months, the pale skin, the relentless fever, the uncontrollable emptying of the bowels, all traceable to the innocent-looking water drawn from this very communal pool. The ancient world offers no defense against typhoid or dysentery, save for the fleeting hope of a strong constitution or the desperate application of prayer and questionable folk medicine. After the first heavy skin is filled and tied off, you must pause, resting your back against the cool, rough wall, your muscles trembling from the effort, even as you calculate the time lost and the need to press on and fill the second, equally heavy vessel. The weight is monumental now, a dense, sloshing burden that demands total concentration. You must learn to walk with a peculiar, deliberate gait that minimizes spillage, as every lost drop feels like a stolen calorie. Finally, with both containers secured, the second leg of your journey begins, and the simple act of carrying the water becomes an immediate, continuous test of strength and endurance, a walking weight training session that lasts until you reach the safety of your home. You pass the other latecomers who are still desperately vying for position at the cistern mouth, their frustrated eyes meeting yours, silently confirming your wisdom in rising before the sun fully cleared the eastern hills. The filled water skins hang low, bumping rhythmically against your legs, their constant, cold weight pulling at the straps and threatening to throw you off balance with every step on the uneven, treacherous Jerusalem ground. Only when the last drop is safely poured into the larger clay storage jar inside your home can you finally allow yourself the luxury of a deep, relieving sigh, knowing that for the next day, the family will not die of thirst, even if the liquid itself holds a hidden, slow-acting promise of illness. This essential, vital task is completed, but now you must prepare for the second, even more complex journey, traversing the chaotic central arteries of the city to engage in the necessary commerce that will sustain you until the next uncertain dawn. Having secured your precious but dubious water supply, you now emerge from the narrow residential alleys and are immediately swallowed by the main thoroughfare, where the true chaotic reality of ancient Jerusalem hits you in a tidal wave of stench, sound, and sudden physical danger. The streets here are not paved with the smooth, orderly flagstones found in Roman military camps or the wealthy upper city. Instead, the path is simply packed, often rutted earth that has absorbed generations of neglect, waste, and the constant traffic of man and beast. Your eyes must constantly scan the ground, a surface that is less a road and more a continuously updated biological hazard map, to avoid the treacherous and unsavory obstacles that litter every inch of the path you must take to reach the busy market district. The most pervasive element underfoot is the overwhelming, inescapable layer of animal dung, left casually by the donkeys, goats, and oxen that serve as the city's primary movers of goods, which is then mashed into the dirt by hundreds of hurried feet. Mixing with the dung is the black, sticky overflow from uncovered, shallow drainage ditches, which carry a foul stew of kitchen scraps, dirty bathwater, and human sewage haphazardly tossed from upper-story windows with a hurried shout of, "Mind your head!" The resulting blend is a slick, treacherous muck, especially near the butchery stalls or the tanneries, where you must sidestep pools of blood, rotting animal parts, and chemical runoff that stain the ground with sickening, unnatural colors. Your flimsy leather sandals offer scant protection, serving less as footwear and more as sponges that quickly soak up the biological soup, ensuring that whatever infectious agents lie upon the ground are now securely strapped directly to your feet. Even a small, untreated cut or scrape on your foot, easily acquired from a sharp piece of pottery, a discarded bone shard, or a stray nail, is not a trivial matter, but a potential death sentence. As the contaminated ground promises to introduce a swift and deadly infection, like a tetanus curse, you learn to walk with an unnatural, high-stepping vigilance, constantly shifting your center of gravity to avoid the slick, mossy patches and the deep ruts that can easily twist an ankle, leaving you vulnerable and immobile in the crush of pedestrian traffic. The smell is a heavy, living entity, an oppressive perfume of fermented refuse, hot urine, stagnant decay, and the metallic tang of old blood, all baked together by the increasingly intense morning sun. The air is so thick with this cocktail that you feel the odor coating the back of your throat, and you have to breathe shallowly through your mouth, which is only a minor concession to the olfactory assault. Near the outer walls, the true middens, the communal refuse heaps, rise up like small, steaming mountains, the homes of giant, aggressive rats and swarms of flies that take to the air in buzzing black clouds as you pass by, carrying the invisible promise of plague and pestilence. It is a profound psychological burden to know that the very ground you walk on, the path that connects your home to the holiest sites in the world, is also the source of half the diseases that afflict your family and shorten your life. You instinctively avoid touching the walls of the buildings that line the street, knowing that they too are coated with the airborne residue of city filth and serve as resting places for disease-carrying insects and rodents. Despite the squalor, life pushes forward. Porters stagger past with loads that defy human capability. Merchants loudly hawk their wares, and the ever-present, watchful eyes of the Roman soldiers track the crowds from elevated positions. You merge into the dense, swelling current of humanity that is now being drawn toward the economic heart of the city, the marketplace, where the physical hazards of the street give way to the equally grave economic and social hazards of commerce. The ground beneath your feet, a chaotic, disease-ridden palette of decay and debris, has delivered you to your next trial. The crowded, cacophonous, and chemically uncertain world of buying and selling. You finally emerge from the noxious, dung-slicked arteries of the lower city into the sprawling, deafening expanse of the marketplace, a vibrant yet intensely predatory environment where the immediate threat of infection is replaced by the calculated economic danger of being utterly fleeced. The market is a sensory detonation, a chaos of high-pitched bartering, the rhythmic pounding of a blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of tethered livestock, and 100 different competing smells. The sharp bite of spices, the sweetness of dates, the heavy aroma of cured meats, and the pervasive, underlying scent of stale bread and sweat. Your meager collection of coins, worn thin and warm from being tightly clutched, feels impossibly small in this teeming arena of commerce, and you know that every transaction must be a victory, or your family will suffer a corresponding loss of vital calories. The greatest risk lies in the most essential commodity, grain. Wheat is the backbone of your diet, but its high price drives unscrupulous vendors to constant, inventive acts of deception, which you must try to anticipate by training your eyes to spot the subtle signs of fraud. You observe the miller's sacks, where the fine, costly white flour is often bulked up with cheaper, coarser barley, or worse, adulterated with chalk powder, or fine, white sand to increase the weight and improve the appearance of the inferior product. You carefully plunge your hand into the grain barrel, rubbing the rough granules between your thumb and forefinger, feeling for an unnatural grittiness or an excess of dust that indicates the presence of filler materials that possess no nutritional value. The oil merchant presents another perilous gamble. The olive oil, necessary for both cooking and lamplight, is frequently thinned with cheaper seed oils or even mixed with rancid animal fats that are barely disguised by heavy perfume. You eye the vendor's scales with immediate suspicion, recognizing that the balancing of the brass pans is less a statement of objective weight and more a performance art designed to subtly favor the seller. The weights used are often shaved down or subtly altered, possessing a false heaviness that steals small, critical fractions of an ounce with every measure, slowly bleeding your family's resources over time. When you attempt to haggle, you must maintain a carefully composed face, not allowing the gnawing anxiety in your stomach to betray your desperation, lest the merchant sense weakness and hold firm on an inflated price that you cannot truly afford. To appear too eager is to invite exploitation, but to walk away might mean losing the only available source of a necessary product before the best portion is gone. The produce stalls, bright with fresh figs, grapes, and pomegranates, offer a brief aesthetic reprieve. But even here, deception reigns supreme. The lower layers of the basket often conceal bruised, spoiled, or worm-eaten fruit hidden beneath a perfectly curated top layer. The true dangers, however, lie in the cooked and prepared goods, often sold quickly to prevent the buyer from examining them too closely, such as the flatbreads that might be baked from moldy flour, or the meat stews that conceal dubious, low-quality cuts of unknown origin. Every small sickness that afflicts your household, the brief, acute stomach aches, the extended bouts of intestinal distress, you instinctively trace back to a questionable purchase in this very market, a daily reminder that your vigilance failed. you understand that the high cost of the temple, the burden of the Roman tax, and the daily competition for resources are all calculated risks you must take to survive. But the simple act of eating remains the most arbitrary and unpredictable hazard of all. Having completed a few critical, if dubious, transactions, enough to ensure the family has food for a day, but no certainty of its quality, you feel the immense magnetic pull of the city's heart, the destination that draws all eyes and much of the city's wealth. Your weary steps now turn eastward, drawn by the majestic, intimidating sight of the elevated platform that defines this entire world, the Temple Mount. The market's tumult gradually fades behind you as you begin the slow, deliberate ascent toward the massive, blindingly white walls of the Temple Mount, feeling the profound shift in the air from commercial chaos to a sacred, financially draining gravity. The very sight of the temple complex, Herod's masterpiece, a colossal triumph of polished stone and shimmering gold, is overwhelming. Yet its presence does not offer comfort, but imposes a crushing, non-negotiable set of economic demands. It is here that spiritual obligation translates directly into material cost, and the two cannot be separated. Your standing before God is intrinsically linked to the thinness of your purse. The immediate obstacle is the necessary conversion of currency. The temple requires its annual tax to be paid only in the pure, specific silver coinage of Tyre, which means you must engage with the money changers who line the broad outer plaza, their tables piled high with stacks of foreign and local money. These men, with their quick hands and sharper eyes, charge exorbitant fees for the exchange, peeling off a significant percentage of your hard-earned local currency simply to facilitate your compliance with divine law, leaving you feeling exploited even in the shadow of the holy sanctuary. The mandatory half-shekel temple tax, which every adult male must pay annually, represents a severe drain on a subsistence budget, often requiring you to forego a full day's wage or to significantly reduce the family's meager food supply for a period of weeks. Beyond the tax, you face the additional expense of maintaining ritual purity, a constant, exhausting requirement in a city rife with impurity from contact with refuse, unwashed crowds, and the presence of death. Even a minor lapse requires a purifying bath in a ritual immersion pool, or mikveh, an act that costs time and effort, further constraining your ability to earn the necessary money to keep your family fed. Should you or a family member become ritually impure, a state that might last days or even weeks, you are barred from full participation in community life and prevented from entering the inner courts, a spiritual isolation that carries a heavy social and psychological weight. But the greatest potential burden is the sacrificial offering itself, which must be presented for specific sins or simply as a routine act of devotion, requiring the purchase of a spotless, unblemished animal, a dove, a goat, or a lamb, depending on your means. The temple courts are filled with vendors selling these sacrificial animals at inflated prices, constantly scrutinizing your choice and often finding a minor blemish on a cheaper animal you selected, forcing you to pay extra for a more expensive, perfect substitute. The sheer cost of acquiring a suitable offering is astronomical, often representing a debt that lingers for months. And the need to maintain ritual perfection in an imperfect world is a perpetual source of anxiety and strain. This constant pressure, the temple tax, the money changer's fee, the expense of purity, the cost of the sacrifice, is the ultimate economic siphon, extracting the surplus wealth from the populace and placing it squarely within the temple's coffers, leaving the poor perpetually walking a financial tightrope. You finally move beyond the intimidating gates. The feeling of spiritual compliance mingled with a deep, weary resentment for the economic hardship that holiness demands, leaving the massive, indifferent stone structure behind. Stepping away from the sacred zone, the political reality of the occupation once again asserts its immediate physical presence as you venture into the less protected, working-class avenues surrounding the temple district, where the greatest danger is not debt, but direct confrontation with the iron fist of Rome. Leaving the marble grandeur and the economic gravity of the temple precincts, you move back into the dense, slightly rougher neighborhoods, where the air is charged not with reverence, but with a taut, simmering hostility that is instantly traceable to the omnipresent, uniformed embodiment of foreign domination. It is impossible to walk more than a few hundred paces without seeing the evidence of the occupation. A carved inscription in Latin, a discarded amphora marked with a Roman seal, or, most terrifyingly, the unmistakable sight of a patrol moving deliberately down the congested street. The Roman soldiers are the visible expression of the heavy hand of the empire, and their presence transforms every public space into a potential stage for humiliation or arbitrary violence, forcing you into a constant state of low-grade anxiety. Your encounter begins with the rhythmic, heavy thump of their leather boots and the loud, metallic clanking of their armor, sounds that cut through the ordinary market noise and cause an immediate, nervous silence to spread through the crowd ahead of their approach. When the patrol arrives, you must immediately adopt the proper posture of deference. Head slightly bowed, eyes lowered, ensuring your movements are slow and non-threatening, confirming your subservient position without question. The centurion leading the file possesses an air of bored authority, his eyes quickly assessing the crowd, looking for any sign of resistance, defiance, or simply an excuse to assert the absolute power that backs his every glance and gesture. The tension is immense, as a momentary lapse in your performance, a gesture too swift, an eye held too long, can be misconstrued as insurrection and met with a brutal, immediate physical response. The most common, non-violent imposition is the demand for forced labor, a right granted by Roman law that they exercise casually and ruthlessly, turning any civilian into a beast of burden for their convenience. You know the law states that any soldier may compel a civilian to carry his equipment, or fasces, for the distance of 1 Roman mile, a burden that can weigh heavily and drain your already limited strength. Today, you are unlucky. A burly legionary singles you out with a curt gesture, handing you his heavy pack, a collection of tools, personal gear, and weapons that feels designed to punish your spine, forcing you to adjust your plans and walk in the opposite direction. As you stagger under the unfamiliar, ill-fitting weight, the soldier walks ahead, unconcerned by your discomfort, demonstrating through this petty act of power the absolute lack of regard the occupier holds for your time, your physical welfare, or your personal dignity. Beyond the physical hardship, the Romans also govern through merciless administration and the constant threat of documentation. They require censuses, tax registries, and identity papers, all of which impose a terrifying bureaucratic burden on a largely illiterate population. A request for papers, for proof of identity or tax compliance, is a moment of pure dread, as any error or missing document is resolved not through explanation, but through fines, imprisonment, or a violent public beating. The psychological toll of this constant visibility and potential for random oppression is immense. You are never truly free, never unobserved, and never more than a breath away from having your entire day or your entire life violently disrupted by the whim of a soldier. Finally, the soldier reaches his arbitrary destination, snatches his pack without a word of thanks, and moves on, leaving you trembling slightly, physically exhausted, but spiritually intact, prompting a desperate need to cleanse the soul and body of this humiliating contact, directing your weary steps toward the public bathhouse. The compelling need to wash away the shame, the physical grime, and the lingering psychological residue of the Roman encounter leads you away from the turbulent streets toward the public bathhouse, a massive, domed structure that stands as a testament to the inescapable cultural influence of the occupying power. The entrance is a bustling bottleneck of humanity, a mix of the working poor seeking temporary relief and the wealthier citizens performing their daily, elaborate ablutions, all paying the small but necessary fee to enter this sanctuary of shared steam and water. The bathhouse, or therme, is more than a place of hygiene. It is a critical social hub, a space for gossip, political talk, and the brief, rare luxury of physical relaxation, where the stress of the city is momentarily exchanged for a different, more subtle kind of threat. As you step inside, the sudden change in atmosphere is immediate and intense. The air is thick, moist, and heavy with the scent of human bodies, residual oils, and the underlying metallic smell of hot water that has been reused dozens of times throughout the day. You move through the apoditerium, or changing room, a noisy, semi-public space where clothes are left unattended on shelves or with questionable attendance, prompting a small, necessary fear of petty theft. Stripping down to a simple loincloth, you are acutely aware of the bodies around you, the stoic scars of the laborers, the pampered softness of the rich, and the lack of privacy that defines this communal cleansing ritual. The sequence begins in the tepidarium, a warm, transitional chamber where your muscles begin their slow, painful protest against the sudden relaxation after a morning of hauling and tension under the sun. The deeper you go, the hotter and more intense the environment becomes, leading you toward the caldarium, the scorching hot room that is the thermal core of the entire structure, designed to induce a deep, cleansing sweat. The room is a hazy, echoing vault of white steam, with voices muffled and distorted, and the sensation of the heat pressing down on your lungs is almost suffocating. Yet your body craves the deep purging of the dirt and anxiety from your pores. Here, the heat opens the skin, but it also opens the body to a host of unseen, infectious dangers that thrive in the communal moisture. The same water, heated and reheated, in which dozens of men have scrubbed off the day's grime, the street filth, the skin flakes, the eye discharge, is recirculated through the system, creating a vast, warm, perfect breeding ground for disease. You notice the telltale signs of chronic infections on many of the patrons, particularly the widespread prevalence of eye diseases like trachoma, which is easily transmitted through the shared steam, the communal dipping pools, or by simply wiping a sweaty face with an unhygienic hand. Skin infections and persistent rashes are equally common, passed easily in the closely packed spaces, a hidden biological commerce occurring beneath the veneer of cleanliness. The final stage is often the cold plunge or frigidarium, a sudden, shocking drop into cool water that momentarily seals your pores and tightens your skin, providing a fleeting sense of true cleanliness. However, the momentary relief is deceptive. The water, while cold, is no less contaminated, often murky and smelling faintly of mildew and residual sulfur. The act of bathing here is a social necessity and a brief psychological reset, a moment of shared humanity with neighbors and strangers alike. But it is not a pure act of health. It is a biological gamble, where the benefit of relaxation and surface cleanliness is traded for the risk of contracting a low-grade, persistent infection that you will carry back into the already compromised air of your home. You spend an hour or so exchanging a few quiet words with an acquaintance, performing the necessary rituals of scraping the skin and oiling the body, feeling momentarily refreshed but far from truly safe. Exiting the steamy warmth and stepping back out into the bright, dry air of the midday street is a shock. And the brief respite is over, reminding you that the most difficult, taxing part of the working day is still ahead. Now, under the unmerciful, searing power of the fully ascended Judean sun, the bathhouse has provided a fleeting illusion of preparedness. But the moment you leave its protective dome, the relentless, uncompromising heat of the Judean summer attacks with a physical intensity that no amount of prayer or ritual washing can mitigate. The sun, high and blindingly white in the cloudless sky, beats down with a violence that seems determined to bake the very moisture from your body, turning the city's stone streets and tightly packed buildings into a massive, heat-radiating oven. The simple, rough-spun linen tunic you wear, meant to provide ventilation, is instantly inadequate, quickly becoming saturated with sweat and clinging uncomfortably to your skin as you begin your labor under the full force of the midday solar scourge. Hydration is a constant losing battle. The dubious water you secured at dawn is long gone, consumed in small, sparing sips, and the thirst that now begins to build is not a simple dryness, but a deep, insistent craving that signals your body's dangerous proximity to systemic failure. You learn to recognize the early signs of heat exhaustion and the deadly approach of heat stroke, symptoms that you observe in your fellow laborers and occasionally in yourself. The sudden, paralyzing muscle cramps, the dizzying lightheadedness, and the chilling realization when the sweat abruptly stops, leaving your skin alarmingly hot and dry. This last symptom is the gravest, an internal warning that your body's delicate temperature regulation system is collapsing, demanding that you immediately cease all work and seek what little shade can be found against a blistering wall. The necessity of your labor, whether hauling goods, quarrying stone, or performing some other physically demanding task in the open air, forces you to endure this solar punishment for hour after brutal hour. Your skin, constantly exposed to the unforgiving UV radiation, is perpetually burned, not merely tanned. The tops of your shoulders, the back of your neck, and any exposed skin are typically a painful, inflamed red, often peeling in thin, parchment-like strips. This chronic sunburn is more than just discomfort. It is a relentless irritant that disrupts your sleep, steals your focus, and makes the necessary act of carrying or resting weight on your shoulders a constant source of stinging, raw pain. The cultural acceptance of this daily physical suffering is absolute. Everyone endures it, and to complain or shirk work due to the heat is simply not an option, as the consequence is starvation, not sympathy. You develop small, ingrained habits to cope with the relentless assault. Constantly wetting the scrap of cloth you keep tucked into your waistband, placing it across your forehead for a brief, fleeting moment of cooling evaporation, or seeking out the narrow, fleeting shadow cast by a taller building during the sun's highest arc. The sun dictates the entire rhythm of the working day, forcing an intensity of effort in the early and late hours, and making the central hours a sluggish, dangerous, and minimally productive haze where every movement is an act of will. The very stone you touch is scalding, forcing you to use thick rags or calloused hands to grasp tools or heavy objects. And the ground underfoot radiates stored heat, turning your sandals into small ovens that cook your soles. The thought of relief is a persistent, necessary mirage that keeps you moving. The promise of evening, the moment when the stones finally begin to release their captive heat, and the possibility of a brief, restorative sleep. As the sun begins its slow, massive descent toward the western horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty roads, your thoughts turn toward the necessity of returning home, focusing not on the brief rest ahead, but on the fragile, temporary architecture that houses your family. With the sun's most intense fury now behind you, you begin the tired journey back through the cooling city streets, but the focus shifts from the external threats of soldiers and sun to the internal fragility of the dwelling that awaits you. Your home, like the vast majority of houses in the lower and working-class districts of Jerusalem, is not a fortress of quarried stone, but a temporary, highly vulnerable structure built primarily of sun-dried mud brick, timber, and straw, a construction method dictated by both economics and speed. This ancient essential material, known as adobe or simple mud brick, is a false promise of solidity, offering a meager barrier against the extremes of the Judean climate and the hazards of urban life. Inside the small, densely packed space, the mud brick walls fail to provide effective insulation, resulting in a constant, frustrating cycle. They retain the day's relentless heat long into the evening, radiating it back into the room and making sleep difficult, only to become intensely cold and damp during the pre-dawn hours. The roof, often a simple layer of compressed earth and branches, is perpetually dusted with dry leaves and debris, and is a constant source of anxiety as it offers little protection against the elements at their worst. During the sporadic but intense winter rainstorms, the roof is notorious for springing leaks, often leading to a sudden, frantic scramble to protect bedding and precious grain stores, while the lower parts of the mud brick walls soak up the water, threatening to soften the structure's integrity. You live with the constant, latent fear that a prolonged or particularly heavy downpour could weaken the walls to the point of structural collapse, a catastrophic event that is not uncommon in the older, poorer districts, and that would instantly render your family homeless and expose your meager possessions. The earth and straw mixture, being a natural and porous medium, also provides a ready-made habitat for a host of unwelcome guests, turning the interior of your home into a shared space with creatures far less appealing than your immediate family. You spend a nervous amount of time each evening checking dark corners and crevices, keenly aware of the sudden, sharp, paralyzing pain inflicted by the small, territorial scorpions that favor the cool, damp safety behind the storage jars. Spiders, often large and alarmingly fast, are an ordinary fixture, building their intricate, dusty webs in the upper corners of the small room, while various biting insects and crawling pests find easy access through the poorly sealed joints and the small gaps between the window frame and the mud walls. The close proximity of these creatures adds another layer to the anxiety of sleep. Every sudden movement or unfamiliar scratch in the middle of the night forces you awake, heart pounding, listening for the telltale skitter of something venomous or the rustle of a scavenging rodent. Furthermore, the mud brick construction and the shared courtyard layout of these communal dwellings ensure a total lack of auditory or visual privacy. Every whispered word, every domestic argument, every private moment is audible to your close neighbors, creating a dense social pressure that pervades every moment spent inside. As the last vestiges of daylight fade through the small, high window, a profound darkness quickly fills the room, demanding that you now address the final great challenge of the day, fighting the suffocating blackness with the unreliable, smoky flicker of fire. The deep, rapid onset of twilight is not a gradual descent into calm, but an immediate, challenging encounter with the profound, suffocating darkness that engulfs the windowless corners of your mud brick home, demanding a costly and risky countermeasure. Your survival requires at least a few more hours of light for tasks such as preparing the meager evening meal, mending clothes, or perhaps teaching the children a passage of scripture, and this necessity forces you to rely entirely upon the simple, essential technology of the oil lamp. The lamp itself is a small, shallow piece of earthenware, often decorated with simple patterns, holding a reservoir of precious olive oil, which you must carefully ration, as every drop burned is a calorie or a coin subtracted from the family's economic equation. Lighting the lamp involves carefully pulling a wick made from twisted flax through the spout, soaking it with oil, and coaxing a flame from a flint and tinder, a small act of creation that brings forth a dim, uncertain light. The resulting illumination is a pathetic, flickering pool of yellow-orange that only managed to push back the encroaching shadows a few feet from the lamp's base, leaving the vast majority of the small room in deep, shifting gloom. This pervasive dimness places an enormous strain on your eyes, forcing you to huddle close to the light source to perform any detailed task, resulting in chronic, burning eye strain and persistent headaches that plague the end of the day. The oil lamp is not merely dim. It is a major source of indoor air pollution, a silent, pervasive hazard that significantly compromises the health of everyone who lives within the confines of the small, poorly ventilated space. The cheaper, poorer quality olive oil, which is all you can afford, burns imperfectly, emitting a continuous, sooty smoke that rises in a slow, black spiral to coat the ceiling and the walls with a layer of grime. More dangerously, the smoke fills the room with fine particulate matter, which is constantly inhaled into the lungs, causing chronic irritation, persistent coughs, and contributing heavily to the respiratory illnesses that are endemic among the city's poor. Living in this enclosed, smoky environment for hours each evening means a constant, long-term degradation of your pulmonary health, adding another silent, slow-acting killer to the list of daily threats. Beyond the pollution, the small, exposed flame is a terrifying hazard in a city of dried mud, straw, and tightly packed wooden frames. A misplaced lamp, a sudden gust of wind, or a simple moment of inattention could instantly transform the family dwelling into a raging inferno. And fire is the nightmare that hangs over every close-knit district. A fire in one home could rapidly consume the entire block, reducing a lifetime of possessions and the only sanctuary a family possesses to a heap of glowing embers and dust, forcing vigilance and care, even in the deepest exhaustion. As the family gathers close to the lamp's weak, comforting glow for the evening meal of bread and perhaps a few dates, the conversation is low, the movements are guarded, and the physical focus is entirely on the small circle of light that is your temporary defense against the dark. The final act of the domestic day, before rolling out the straw mats, is the extinguishing of the flame, plunging the room into absolute blackness, where the physical safety of the day gives way to the equally dangerous, complex realm of social interaction that governs survival in this close-knit, highly judgmental community. The moment the lamp is extinguished and the protective circle of its faint light vanishes, the domestic focus shifts entirely from the physical hazards of fire and smoke to the complex, intangible dangers of social perception. This closed world of ancient Jerusalem is governed by a crushing, rigid system of honor and shame, a constant social pressure that is far more durable and pervasive than the Roman occupation or the temple's economic demands. Survival, depends not just on your personal strength or your ability to feed your family, but entirely on the collective, often cruel, opinion of your neighbors and the wider community. Every glance exchanged in the morning rush, every word spoken at the cistern, and every transaction finalized in the market is an audition for approval, a performance meant to secure or defend the family's fragile social standing. Your life is not your own. It is lived under the constant, unflinching gaze of your peers, and the boundaries between private conduct and public knowledge are paper-thin, easily shattered by a misplaced word or an accidental misstep. The weight of this scrutiny is felt most keenly in the meticulous care you take to maintain the outward appearance of industry, piety, and solvency. Even if you are starving, your tunic must appear clean and well-mended. If your children are ill, you must present them as robust and healthy. If you are drowning in debt, you must speak with the confident tone of a man of means. Any perceived flaw, a public display of anger, a failure to observe a minor religious law, a child caught stealing a piece of fruit, does not merely reflect poorly on the individual. it is instantly magnified into a stain upon the entire household, dragging the family name down into the murky depths of public shame. Gossip, fueled by the intense proximity of the dwellings and the need for social currency, is the most potent weapon in this culture, possessing the power to ruin livelihoods faster than any Roman levy. A malicious, whispered rumor, perhaps suggesting that you are secretly associating with zealots, or that your wife is not appropriately modest in her dealings, or that you secured your latest job through questionable means, travels with terrifying speed through the narrow streets. By morning, the rumor, once a quiet suggestion, is treated as established fact, leading to devastating immediate consequences. The moneylender will refuse you credit, the merchant will inflate his prices, and prospective business partners will suddenly find reasons to withdraw their offers. All because the invisible currency of trust, earned over a lifetime of careful conduct, has been devalued by a few careless words. This constant need for social performance dictates that your family life, even behind the mud brick walls, must be a guarded, highly disciplined affair. Children are taught from their earliest conscious breath the crucial necessity of respect, silence, and obedience, knowing that their small actions in the public courtyard could invite devastating criticism upon their parents. The wife, whose reputation for virtue and industry is the bedrock of the family's honor, must be fiercely protected from any suggestion of impropriety, leading to rigid restrictions on her movements and interactions in the city. The pressure is suffocating, forcing you to police your own emotions, to swallow your pride in the face of insult, and to feign indifference to the success of your competitors, always prioritizing the strategic defense of the family's reputation over the honest expression of your true feelings. The fear of public shaming creates a deep, instinctive aversion to drawing attention to yourself in any negative way. You pray in the synagogue with meticulous observance, ensuring your neighbor sees your devotion. You carry your pack with silent, stoic endurance past the soldiers, demonstrating resilience. You haggle firmly but politely in the market, showing shrewdness without greed. The exhaustion from this constant high-stakes performance is often more draining than the physical labor of hauling stone, because it is an anxiety that can never truly be put down or rested. It is a psychological tightrope walk over the abyss of social ruin, and the consequences of slipping are not a broken bone, but a permanent exclusion from the necessary networks of credit, trust, and mutual support that keep a struggling family alive in this volatile world. The pervasive nature of this social system means that even as you drift toward sleep, the last thoughts in your mind are not of the next day's labor, but of the calculated actions you must take tomorrow to maintain the fragile, indispensable illusion of respectability. This all-encompassing concern for public image naturally places an overwhelming, agonizing burden on the most fragile members of the community, the children, whose small, vulnerable lives are constantly on the cusp of heartbreaking disaster. The deep, ever-present weight of social expectation is momentarily eclipsed by a far more profound, ancient terror that stalks every household in Jerusalem, a silent predator that preys on the innocent and ignores all boundaries of wealth or piety, the reality of child mortality. In this world, the loss of an infant or a young child is not a rare tragedy, but an accepted, grim fixture of existence. A dark, necessary calculation that gnaws at the edges of every parent's love. Most couples know, with a chilling certainty that settles deep in the bones, that half or more of the children they conceive might never survive to see the age of 10, making the act of raising a family a continuous, agonizing struggle against a relentless, invisible foe. The emotional toll of this statistical reality is immense, forcing parents to walk a terrible, defensive line between profound attachment and necessary emotional distance. You allow yourself to love your children fiercely, as is your nature, but a small, guarded part of your heart remains intentionally aloof, a painful defense mechanism erected against the near certainty of future grief. You dare not speak the truth out loud, but you constantly observe your children with a clinical, analytical eye, searching for the first, faint sign of the illness that could snatch them away overnight. Knowing that a simple, common fever can become a terminal crisis with terrifying swiftness in the total absence of reliable medicine. The symptoms, when they inevitably appear, are often heartbreakingly familiar and seemingly minor. A sudden, glassy-eyed listlessness, a refusal to eat, and a forehead that feels alarmingly hot to the touch. A burning, internal furnace that signifies the body's small, inadequate defenses beginning to fail. As a parent, you are utterly helpless, reduced to performing rituals that are more comforting than curative. The wiping of the fevered brow with cool, clean water, the offering of sips of weak herbal tea, the desperate, repetitive invocation of prayers and ancient blessings. The silence of the night, usually a time of rest, becomes an agonizing, prolonged vigil as you sit beside the small, restless body, listening to the shallow, struggling breaths, knowing that you can offer no true intervention against the unseen enemy raging within their young blood. The fever crests and breaks like a storm, sometimes retreating as quickly as it came, leaving the child pale and weak, but undeniably alive. Other times, it simply intensifies, leading to a terrifying delirium, a sudden, alarming convulsion, and then a profound, chilling stillness. When the loss occurs, the grief is sharp, immense, and private, but it must be managed and contained quickly. The rituals of mourning are observed, the tearing of garments, the brief period of intense sorrow, but the necessity of survival dictates that you cannot afford an extended period of debilitating grief. The small body is quickly prepared and interred in the dry, unforgiving earth, perhaps next to a sibling whose face is now only a dim, fading memory. And then the painful return to the daily grind of survival must begin. This routine of loss casts a heavy shadow over every aspect of family life. The surviving children are cherished, but their frailty is never forgotten, and the constant threat dictates that resources must be spread thin, invested carefully, with no guarantee of future return. The emotional exhaustion of perpetually preparing for loss and the sheer psychological effort required to endure the inevitable grief creates a profound, subtle scar on the character of every adult in this city. It is a world where love is a constant act of bravery, a willingness to open your heart to a pain that is almost certainly coming, and the years lost to sickness and death are simply factored into the price of raising a family. This tragic reality often forces you to seek out any form of assistance, any hope of intervention, leading you away from the despair of domestic helplessness and toward the unpredictable, often dubious, relief offered by those few who claim to possess the knowledge to fight the unseen forces of illness. The local village doctor. The moment of crisis, when a child's fever refuses to break or a persistent internal ailment threatens to consume a family member, often pushes you toward the last, most unpredictable recourse available in this age of ignorance and suffering: the intervention of the local healer, the village doctor, whose knowledge is a curious, potentially dangerous mixture of ancient folk wisdom, religious tradition, and primitive, untested physiological theories. These practitioners are not trained in the modern sense, lacking any sterile equipment or genuine understanding of microbial contagion. Their authority rests instead on a commanding personality, a long family lineage of healing, and a confident, unwavering belief in the efficacy of their often terrifying methods. You approach the healer's dwelling, often a small, dark room, heavy with the pungent medicinal aroma of drying herbs and unknown organic compounds, with a profound and contradictory mix of desperate hope and chilling apprehension. After detailing the symptoms, which the healer listens to with a self-important solemnity, he launches into his diagnosis, which is almost certainly rooted in the prevailing, unquestioned theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this ancient doctrine, all sickness, from a mild headache to a raging fever, is caused by an imbalance in these four essential fluids, and the entire goal of treatment is to restore the body's equilibrium by purging the excess humor. The resulting treatment is frequently as alarming as the disease itself. If the affliction is diagnosed as an excess of blood, the doctor's immediate, terrifying solution is bloodletting, performed with unsterilized copper or iron instruments that carry the invisible, lethal risk of infection far worse than the original ailment. A tight bandage is tied around the arm or leg, causing the vein to swell, and then a deep, uncomfortably swift incision is made, allowing the hot, dark blood to stream into a basin, sometimes for a dangerously long duration that leaves the patient alarmingly pale and weak. Alternatively, the remedy might involve a forced purge, the administration of a noxious concoction of strong-tasting herbs, animal bile, or even crushed mineral compounds, designed to induce violent vomiting or relentless diarrhea, expelling the supposed excess bile or phlegm from the system, leaving the patient dehydrated and utterly exhausted. Beyond these aggressive interventions, the healer's pharmacy is a cabinet of dubious concoctions and powerful, often toxic, herbal mixtures. One popular remedy involves grinding together specific plants with honey or wine, while another might incorporate dried animal parts, powdered stone, or even small, written religious charms intended to address the spiritual or magical cause of the illness. The physical act of swallowing these bitter, repulsive remedies is an act of sheer will and desperate faith, praying that the powerful taste is indicative of a powerful cure and not simply a deadly poison. The cost of this treatment is often ruinous, demanding a significant payment in coin or trade goods, extracting a high economic toll for a service that is, statistically speaking, likely to have no positive effect and a significant chance of causing harm. Yet, despite the palpable risks and the often horrifying physical pain inflicted by the intervention, you submit to the healer's pronouncements with a profound, resigned acceptance. In a world devoid of effective science, where the gods, demons, and spirits are believed to hold ultimate sway over life and death, the confidence of the healer offers a necessary psychological balm, a sense of having done something to fight the illness, rather than sitting idly by as the sickness takes its course. The treatment is a gamble, a desperate negotiation with the unknown forces of the body, and often the only certainty is that the economic pain of the transaction will linger long after the patient has either recovered by chance or succumbed to the combined forces of the disease and the cure. Having confronted the fragile reality of the body and the limited, often dangerous scope of human intervention, your thoughts now turn to the realm of the unseen, the spiritual world of curses, blessings, and the pervasive threat of malevolent, invisible forces that dictate so much of your daily anxiety. Having wrestled with the physical realities of the body, its frailty, its infections, and its agonizing vulnerability to the limits of human medicine, your mind now turns toward the far more numerous, more unpredictable, and infinitely more terrifying dangers that occupy the unseen realm. The ancient world is thick with spiritual hazard, a complex ecology of malevolent forces, restless spirits, and minor demons that are believed to lurk in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness or an unguarded threshold to inflict misfortune. This pervasive belief transforms every ordinary act into a small ritual of defense, making spiritual security as demanding and exhausting as physical labor. The ultimate threat is not a fever you can treat or a thief you can see, but the unpredictable malice of the unseen. The most common, most feared, and most easily transmitted spiritual danger is the evil eye, or ayin hara. This is not a force wielded by a witch or a sorcerer, but an accidental, passive power possessed by those who are envious or even overly admiring. A person looking with too much intensity upon your healthy child, your bountiful harvest, or your newly acquired possession can unwittingly steal its blessing, causing the child to fall ill, the crop to fail, or the possession to be suddenly lost or broken. The fear of this arbitrary malice dictates a profound need for secrecy and understatement in your public life, reinforcing the honor-shame culture you already inhabit. You never boast of your good fortune. You dress your children in slightly worn clothes even if you could afford better. And you always diminish your own successes in conversation, offering credit to God and deflecting attention away from your family, lest an envious glance sees what you have worked so hard to maintain. Combat this constant spiritual siege. You rely on a complex armory of protective measures. Around your neck, or perhaps tied to your children's wrists, you might wear an amulet, a small piece of stone, bone, or even a scroll fragment inscribed with a sacred name or a verse of protection. These amulets are not officially sanctioned by the temple hierarchy, who frown upon such folk magic, but they are a necessary personal defense, a tangible piece of resistance against the invisible tides of misfortune. You learn the specific, traditional gestures and phrases used to ward off immediate danger. The quick spitting motion over the shoulder, the sudden recitation of a protective blessing when someone praises your property too enthusiastically, or the careful application of ash or charcoal on a baby's forehead to draw the gaze away from the child's true, vulnerable beauty. The rituals of spiritual defense extend to the architecture of your life. On your doorway, the small, carefully placed mezuzah containing scrolls of the Shema provides a constant barrier, a sacred challenge to any demon or malevolent spirit attempting to enter your home. You are meticulously careful about where you walk and when you speak. Nighttime, especially after the moon has set and before dawn, is understood to be the most dangerous period, the time when spirits are most active, when the ground is most cursed, and when you must remain silent and indoors, relying only on the power of your interior prayer. You are careful not to throw out water after sunset, lest a thirsty spirit be disturbed. And you never carelessly leave tools or sharp objects out, as they might be used by a demon against your sleeping family. The exhaustion of this constant vigilance is immense. Every sleepless night spent listening to a child cough is instantly framed not just as a medical problem, but as a spiritual attack, perhaps an attempt at possession, demanding not only a visit to the healer, but a visit to the local holy man for an exorcism or a powerful, ritually inscribed prayer. You buy the sacrificial doves not only out of duty, but out of a desperate, transactional need to secure divine favor, hoping that the small, costly life offered on the altar will serve as a shield against the cosmic forces aligned against your fragile existence. The spiritual life, therefore, is not a calm sanctuary of faith, but a high-stakes, perpetual battle waged in the quiet hours and secret corners of your home, consuming emotional energy and financial resources, all in a relentless effort to maintain the delicate boundary between a precarious, living safety and the waiting, predatory chaos of the unseen world. As the sun rises again and the spiritual night retreats, your thoughts shift from the incorporeal threats to the most physical, most pressing threat to your health that exists in the heart of the crowded, dirty city. The unspeakable dangers festering right beneath your feet, the necessary preoccupation with demons and the evil eye is a spiritual defense against invisible harm. But the city itself harbors a biological evil, a constant, pervasive threat that is equally unseen, yet far more reliably lethal. This threat rises from the complete and utter failure of ancient Jerusalem's infrastructure to cope with the sheer volume of human waste generated by its dense population. The great Roman aqueducts bring life-giving, if contaminated, water into the city, but there is no corresponding system to remove the waste, creating a permanent, systemic condition of squalor that acts as a continuous, silent engine of plague and sickness. The primary solution for dealing with human and household waste is the cesspit, a deep, crudely dug hole, often located in the communal courtyard or simply carved into the natural bedrock beneath or adjacent to the dwelling. These pits are frequently uncovered or covered only by a loose, unstable slab of stone or wood, serving as vast open reservoirs of fermenting filth. They contain everything: human excrement, animal offal, kitchen scraps, and the runoff from unwashed bodies and clothes, all seeping slowly into the porous earth beneath the foundations of your home. The air around these cesspits, particularly during the hot summer months, is a suffocating blanket of methane, ammonia, and the sweet, putrid scent of decay, a stench that the body eventually learns to ignore, but which is a constant, physical reminder of the biological war being waged in your immediate environment. The danger of the cesspit is multi-layered and insidious. Firstly, the uncovered waste provides the perfect, fertile breeding ground for the city's swarms of flies and mosquitoes. These insects move freely between the stagnant pools of filth in the food preparation areas in your home, acting as tiny, tireless biological couriers, transferring the invisible, microscopic agents of dysentery, typhoid, and other acute intestinal diseases directly to the bread you eat and the water you drink. The sheer abundance of disease-carrying insects in the home is a constant, losing battle against nature, and you spend endless, irritating minutes swatting at them, knowing that everyone that lands is a potential contamination. Secondly, and perhaps more terrifyingly, the waste does not stay contained. Through the capillary action of the porous earth and the natural seepage through the bedrock, the contents of the cesspits constantly filter downward and outward, leaching dangerous pathogens directly into the soil and, critically, into the communal cisterns and private storage jars that collect ground and rainwater. The same unwholesome, murky taste you noted in the water you drew at dawn is often the direct result of a nearby cesspit contaminating the underground water table, creating a vicious, unavoidable cycle where the liquid consumed to sustain life is simultaneously responsible for bringing sickness and death. You live under the inescapable knowledge that the ground beneath your feet is fundamentally poisoned, an endless source of infection that can never truly be cleaned or sealed off. The lack of effective institutional sanitation means that the squalor is not contained to the poor districts, while the wealthy may have deeper pits or perhaps use the public sewers near the main streets. The underlying problem of waste removal plagues the entire city. Even the act of walking down the street, as you discovered earlier, involves navigating a surface contaminated by overflow and spillage from these pits, ensuring that pathogens are tracked directly back into the home on your sandals and the hems of your tunic. The accumulated toxins and disease-breeding filth represent an invisible plague that is far more devastating to the city's long-term health than any famine or military action, relentlessly shortening the lifespans of its inhabitants and ensuring that chronic, debilitating illness is the standard condition of existence. It is a profound, maddening irony that you expend so much effort ensuring ritual purity before God, only to live in an environment where true physical cleanliness is functionally impossible, where the very air you breathe and the ground you stand upon are saturated with the biological residue of countless others. Finally, as the sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon, promising a brief abatement of the heat, the focus of the household shifts inward, turning to the last great ritual of the day, the communal sharing of the meager calories won through great effort, with the physical dangers of the day momentarily paused and the oppressive scrutiny of the community receding into the gathering gloom. The focus of the family settles upon the deepest, most primal necessity, the sharing of the evening meal. This dinner ritual is more than a simple act of eating. It is a sacred, structured event that affirms family unity, reinforces social hierarchy, and serves as the final, critical act of the day's survival. The precise accounting and distribution of the few hard-won calories. The meal preparation itself is a final, weary expenditure of energy, often involving the tedious grinding of grain that you purchased, now being crushed between two heavy stones by the women of the house to create the flour for the flatbreads that form the centerpiece of the diet. The preparation area is small, marked by the constant presence of the hearth, a small, clay-lined depression where a meager fire of dried dung, twigs, or scarce charcoal is nursed into existence, ensuring that the smoke quickly adds to the persistent indoor air pollution. The most common fare is deliberately simple and durable. A thick, dense barley bread, perhaps a bowl of lentils, slow-cooked with whatever dried herbs were available, and, on a truly fortunate day, a small piece of salted fish or some dried dates. Meat is a rarity, reserved only for festival days or the aftermath of a sacrificial offering, meaning the diet is heavily reliant on starches, lacking the critical fats and proteins necessary for sustained health and energy. When the food is ready, the family gathers not around a high table, but around a low, three-legged piece of wood, or simply on mats spread upon the floor. If space allows, and the family is wealthy enough to afford the custom, you might recline on low, simple couches or cushions, adopting the Roman habit of eating while leaning on your left elbow, though more often the working-class family simply squats or sits cross-legged. This geometry of the meal is crucial, as the serving and seating arrangements strictly adhere to the family hierarchy. The head of the household, you, takes the first and best portion of the food, and often the best seat, followed by the elder sons, then the wife, and finally the younger children, who receive the last and smallest portions. This distribution is a stark, necessary lesson for the children, teaching them their place in the social order and the harsh reality that resources are finite and prioritized. The meal is eaten slowly, deliberately, using small pieces of bread to scoop up the stewed lentils or to dip into the limited amount of olive oil, a custom that minimizes the need for scarce utensils and maximizes the consumption of the staple bread. Conversation during the meal is often subdued, constrained by the exhaustion of the day and the ever-present awareness of the food's scarcity. Every person at the table is acutely aware of the calorie count, the mental calculation of how much energy the food will provide against how much is needed for the morning's labor. It is a form of shared, silent gratitude, not merely for the food, but for the day of life that allowed it to be procured. Despite the scarcity, the meal is also a momentary reprieve, a communal moment of safety and warmth that counters the relentless hostility of the city. The act of breaking bread together solidifies the family unit, reminding everyone present that they are part of a unified, interdependent whole, capable of resisting the external pressures of Rome, disease, and poverty. The taste of the food is simple, often bland, but its sustenance is profound, a direct transformation of your day's suffering into the energy needed for tomorrow's survival. Once the meal is finished, the low table or mat is quickly cleared, the remaining crumbs meticulously gathered and saved, and the pots washed with the carefully rationed water, leaving the room once again spare and ready for the necessities of the night. With the last ember of the hearth fire dying down and the final prayers said over the spent day, your attention is drawn to the final, echoing sound of the evening. The heavy, final grinding of stone and wood as the massive city gates are sealed, ushering in a new, distinct phase of danger. The close of the day in ancient Jerusalem is marked by a sudden, decisive sound that carries throughout the city's confined districts. The slow, grinding groan of the colossal city gates being dragged shut, followed by the heavy, echoing thud of the massive wooden beams dropped into place, sealing the city against the external world. This final, physical act of closing the gates at sunset is an absolute, non-negotiable end to all outside movement. A signal that the day's chaos has been exchanged for the deep, contained, and altogether more threatening chaos of the night. The atmosphere instantly shifts, becoming palpable and heavy with a contained energy, transforming the crowded, bustling metropolis into a massive, locked chamber where all inhabitants are trapped until dawn. The moment the sound fades, a cold wave of realization washes over the community. Every person is now solely responsible for their defense, relying only on the integrity of their own doors and the silence of their own prayers against whatever dangers the darkness holds. The noise of the street does not simply cease. It is profoundly, unnervingly muffled, replaced by an intimate and unsettling silence that allows the sounds of individual human and animal activity to carry for unnerving distances. You can now hear the distant, high-pitched wail of a distressed child, the sharp, authoritative bark of a guard dog, and the low, tense murmur of an argument 3 houses down the alley. This shift in auditory landscape intensifies the sense of vulnerability, as you know that any loud, unexpected noise now signifies trouble, whether it be a thief at your neighbor's door or the sudden, rhythmic tread of a military patrol moving under the protective cover of darkness. The stone walls of the alleyways, so good at trapping the heat of the day, now act as strange acoustic funnels, amplifying and distorting ordinary creaks and scurries, turning the rustle of a rat into a potential breaking and entering, forcing the mind into a constant, low-level state of hyper-alertness that makes deep rest impossible. The darkness itself is profound, an almost physical entity that swallows the weak light filtering from your single oil lamp. With no public lighting, the winding streets become treacherous, pitch-black labyrinths, making any movement outside a reckless gamble. Even carrying a lamp is dangerous, as the single flame only serves to advertise your position to those who wish you harm. The dangers of the night are manifold and distinctly different from the sunlit threats. Firstly, the city gates may keep the legions of Rome out, but they also trap the city's population inside with a host of predatory humans. Thieves, emboldened by the darkness and the silence, move through the alleys, targeting the poorest dwellings, knowing that a desperate family will offer no resistance for fear of a loud confrontation drawing the attention of Roman night watchmen. You sleep lightly, your hand instinctively close to a heavy stone or a piece of wood, listening for the telltale, faint scraping of feet outside your door, or the quiet, insistent attempt to pry open the weak latch. The door, barred with a heavy, crudely cut log, is the final physical boundary between your family and the night's malice, and every creak in the wood, under pressure, sends a jolt of ice through your veins. Secondly, the animals of the city, normally kept in check by the human presence, now move freely. Packs of stray dogs, fierce and starving, fight over the refuse piles, their growls and sudden, violent clashes echoing off the stone walls. More terrifyingly, the occasional wild animal, a stray jackal, or perhaps a desert fox, drawn by the stench of the middens, can slip in before the gates close, posing a direct threat to livestock and potentially to unattended children. The greatest, most unpredictable danger, however, remains the Roman garrison. While the general population is contained, the Roman patrols, the vigiles, move with unchallenged impunity in the darkness, enforcing the curfew. Their patrols are often less about maintaining order and more about exercising a terrifying, unseen dominance, using the night to conduct searches, make arrests, or simply to assert their power through random acts of brutality that leave no public witnesses. As they move, the light of their flickering oil torches cuts sharp, momentary slices through the absolute blackness, appearing and disappearing around corners in brief, shocking flashes that reveal the silent, frozen terror of anyone caught outside or peering from a window slit. The Romans used the cloak of night to make their actions entirely unscrutinized and unaccountable, using the darkness as a tool for political intimidation and casual violence that daylight would never allow. The fear is not just of being caught out late, but of the vigils choosing your door at random, knowing that once they are inside your home, their authority is absolute and brutal. The weight of the locked gates is an acute psychological burden, transforming your home from a sanctuary into a sealed box. Before settling in for the night, you ensure the children and the women of the household are settled in the innermost corner of the room, as far away from the vulnerable door as possible. A small, subconscious act of protective positioning. The collective energy of the city, so manic and frantic during the day, is now condensed into a dense, oppressive silence, punctuated only by sounds of fear. You are a captive of the city, forced to endure the night's dangers, with no hope of escape or external assistance. The hours between the closing and the opening are a long, tense holding of breath, a test of faith and endurance played out in the dark, where the only certainties are the slow passage of time and the constant nagging sounds of a restless, fearful community waiting for the relief of the morning sun to finally unlock the ancient city once more. The moment the city gates sealed shut, exchanging the day's din for the muffled quiet of a locked vessel, it did not usher in true silence. Instead, the profound darkness became a stage for a new, more intimate, and utterly relentless kind of auditory oppression, making the possibility of a full night's uninterrupted rest an agonizing fantasy. The thick stone and mud brick walls, which blocked the grand noises of the city, paradoxically amplified the smaller, closer sounds, turning the narrow, enclosed alleyways into acoustic chambers that contained and distorted every local disturbance. The night was a complex, continuous symphony of anxiety, played by the city's unseen, restless residents, forcing the weary mind into a constant state of hyper-alertness that bled the restorative power from sleep. The most insistent performers In this nocturnal cacophony were the animals, the essential working creatures of the city whose presence was a guarantee of both life and noise, at the mouths of the main thoroughfares, or tied to strong, weathered posts outside the ground floor rooms of merchants, were the donkeys. These beasts of burden, having hauled heavy sacks of grain, stone, or water skins throughout the day, were often tethered without the luxury of a stable, their rawhide and thick coats offering little comfort against the cool, damp night air. Their discomfort expressed itself in a jarring, unpredictable violence of sound. A donkey, unsettled by a passing rat or simply reacting to the deep hunger pangs of its own gut, would suddenly shatter the momentary quiet with a long, grating, agonizing bray. A sound that was less a simple noise and more a physical tear in the fabric of the night. The sound was not muffled. It was a high-pitched, drawn-out cry that seemed to startle the very stones, echoing down the alleys for minutes after the donkey fell silent, leaving the human ear ringing and the heart pounding in sudden, startled confusion. This was not a sound one could grow accustomed to. Its randomness and sheer volume ensured its function as a psychological weapon, guaranteeing that just as one began to sink into a heavy sleep, one would be violently thrown back to wakefulness, demanding a recalculation of the safety of the dark. Interspersed with the unpredictable braying was the constant territorial warfare of the dogs. Jerusalem was home to countless strays, packs of gaunt, aggressive curs that acted as the city's unofficial waste disposal unit, fighting over the refuse heaps and the offal tossed carelessly into the ditches. Their barks were sharp, immediate, and utterly frantic, often beginning as a low, guttural warning and escalating instantly into a terrifying chorus of aggressive challenges, usually centered around a contested food scrap or a sudden intrusion into their territory. Mixed with the strays were the powerful, well-fed guard dogs belonging to the wealthier homes and the Roman garrison, whose barks were deeper, more authoritative, and carried a chilling implication of official violence. The knowledge that a dog's bark could draw the attention of a nearby Roman patrol, or that the sudden silence of a dog meant that a thief had successfully breached a threshold, transformed their noise from a simple annoyance into a barometer of danger. You would lie on your straw mat, listening to the location and intensity of the barking. Was it moving closer? Was it directed at your door? Using the dog's activity as a crude, unreliable map of the night's ongoing threats. But the most intimate and inescapable disturbance came from the human neighbors themselves. The mud brick dwellings were not separated by true walls, but by thin partitions or shared courtyards, creating a condition of total, involuntary intimacy. The noises of the adjacent family's domestic life, amplified by the heavy quiet, were not sounds you could ignore. They were sounds you were forced to live through. You could hear the sudden, sharp, hacking cough of the elderly man next door, a deep, wet sound that spoke of a chronic, terminal respiratory illness acquired from years of smoke inhalation and damp. The sound, when heard in the dark, was a chilling reminder of your own body's frailty. You could hear the muffled, low-voiced arguments between a husband and wife, tense whispers that carried a deep, simmering frustration, and the sudden, short, violent cry of a disciplined child, the noise of private distress made universally public. And then there was the physical reality of sleep itself, the profound snoring of a neighbor, a heavy, rasping sound that vibrated through the shared wall was inescapable. Every adjustment of a body on a nearby mat, every sigh of deep exhaustion, every sudden, frustrated shift of position on the straw was audible. The mind, desperate for rest, would seize upon these micro disturbances, weaving them into a continuous, irritating tapestry of noise that prevented the deepest, most restorative stages of sleep. You would cover your head with a corner of your rough wool mantle, trying to create a small, temporary pocket of manufactured silence. But the low, underlying drone of the city's contained restlessness, the creaks of timbers settling, the low moans of sick animals, the distant, rhythmic footfalls of the Roman vigils, would always penetrate, keeping a portion of your awareness active and vigilant. This constant auditory assault meant that true, deep rest was almost impossible. You would wake repeatedly, heart leaping at an unexpected noise, only to sink back into a shallow, fitful doze, aware that you were drawing close to the inevitable cacophony of the dawn, still feeling the crushing fatigue of the previous day. The sleeplessness was not a luxury. It was a slow, debilitating poison that made the heat more punishing, the Roman presence more terrifying, and the economic struggle more difficult, dulling the mind's ability to think shrewdly and making the body susceptible to weakness. The night was supposed to be a time of renewal, but in ancient Jerusalem, it was simply a shift in the nature of the warfare, a continuous battle waged against the disturbances of the dark. The final, quiet sounds of the restless night were often the most irritating. The subtle, scratchy, and deeply localized noises that originated not from outside the dwelling, but from within the straw mat and the very cloth of your tunic. This shift from the communal, external disruption to the personal, internal torment signaled the arrival of the next most persistent enemy. The transition from the external warfare of noise to the internal torment of pests was swift and seamless, marking the true, miserable intimacy of life in the ancient city. If the dogs and donkeys were the orchestra of the night, the fleas, lice, and bed bugs were the relentless, microscopic musicians, playing a constant, high-pitched tune of irritation directly upon your skin. These small, bloodthirsty denizens were not occasional visitors, but permanent, thriving residents, the true, inescapable landlords of every home, and their presence ensured that the physical relief of lying down was instantly replaced by the continuous, maddening war against the forever itch. You shared your existence with these tiny, relentless tormentors from the moment you woke until the moment you finally succumbed to exhaustion. The fleas, small, fast, and possessing a terrifying jumping ability, were the most numerous, breeding rapidly in the dirt floors, the straw mats, and the wool of the rough garments. Their bites were sharp, sudden, and instantly noticeable. A tiny, invisible pinprick, followed by an immediate, deep, and satisfying urge to scratch. Even in the deepest sleep, the subconscious mind registered the assault, causing a fitful, restless turning and an almost continuous, subtle scraping of fingernails against skin. disrupting the sleep cycle long before the conscious mind was aware of the attack. Your skin, perpetually under siege, bore the visible evidence of this nocturnal combat. Constellations of tiny, red raised bumps, often clustered around the ankles, the waistline, and the folds of the elbows, perpetually inflamed and often scabbed over from repeated desperate scratching. Worse than the fleas were the lice, a condition of profound misery and deep social shame. Head lice, or Pediculus humanus capitis, and body lice were endemic, passing easily from person to person in the close confines of the shared dwelling, the public bath, and the market crush. Dealing with them was a tedious, humiliating ritual. You would have to sit patiently while a family member painstakingly picked through your hair or the seams of your garment, removing the tiny white nits, eggs, and the larger grayish adults, a process called lousing that was endless and always necessary. The discovery of lice brought with it the immediate stigma of being unclean, a social stain that, though common among the poor, was deeply felt and something you desperately tried to conceal from your neighbors. The perpetual itching associated with the presence of lice often led to open sores and secondary infections, particularly on the scalp or around the hairline, compounding the physical discomfort with the real fear of a systemic infection taking root. The most insidious of the trinity of pests were the bedbugs, small, flat creatures that hid in the crevices of the mud walls and the joints of the wooden furniture during the day, emerging only under the complete cover of darkness. Unlike the fleas, whose bites were immediate, the bedbugs were silent, deliberate feeders. They would crawl onto your exposed skin, often the face, neck, and hands, and feed for minutes at a time, leaving behind rows of intensely irritating welts. You would often wake not to the bite itself, but to the sight of small, disturbing spots of your own dried blood on the coarse straw mat or on the linen of your tunic. Silent evidence of the unceasing, parasitic consumption that occurred while you lay helpless in the darkness. There was no effective pest control available. The only remedy was constant, exhausting labor. You would routinely drag the straw mats outside, beating them violently against a stone wall to dislodge the occupants, only to know that within hours they would be repopulated. You would use crude herbal mixtures, ash, or strong-smelling oils, rubbing them into the seams of the clothes, or sleeping near burning animal dung, which added to the smoky air pollution, hoping that the acrid smell would drive the pests away. But the pests were simply a part of the ecological reality of the city, a reflection of the close proximity of humans, animals, and filth. The sheep, goats, and donkeys that occupied the shared courtyard or the adjacent storage room were reservoirs for fleas and ticks, and the constant cycle of cleaning and reinfestation was a wearying, losing battle. Sleep, therefore, was not a restful cessation of activity. It was a continuous, low-grade battleground. It was a time of fitful scratching, interrupted dreams, and the constant sensation of crawling skin. The cumulative effect of this nightly torment was immense. Chronic exhaustion, skin conditions that never truly healed, and a psychological weariness that came from knowing that even in the supposed sanctuary of your own home, your body was under continuous, unchallenged attack. This perpetual torment of the body served as a miserable counterpoint to the relentless psychological scrutiny of the day, cementing the truth that life in ancient Jerusalem offered no true place of rest or security, even in the deepest moments of domestic retreat. The exhaustion of this nightly battle against the pests was immense, but as morning dawned, the body's vulnerability was immediately replaced by the critical necessity of defending the family's economic future. The pests that attacked the skin were only one form of menace. The pests that attacked the stored food were a direct threat to survival itself. If the physical assault of the body by fleas was a measure of daily discomfort, the attack on the stored food by rodents and insects was a direct, terrifying assault on the very foundation of the family's survival. The grain, the wheat and barley that formed the dense, essential core of the diet, was not merely a commodity. It was the physical representation of the family's security, the accumulated, hard-won reserve that stood between them and imminent starvation. Protecting this meager stockpile was a continuous, agonizing struggle against a host of persistent, highly adaptive pests who saw the family's barrel as their own boundless feast. The grain itself was typically stored in one of two ways: either in large, heavy ceramic jars, sealed with rough stone lids and placed in the coolest corner of the dwelling, or, in the case of poorer families, in sacks made of thick, crude leather or woven burlap, often buried slightly into the cool, packed dirt floor. These storage methods were primitive, offering little resistance to the twin terrors of the grain supply: the larger, more powerful rodents and the countless microscopic armies of insects. The sound of the rodents was the most alarming auditory signal of resource loss. After the oil lamp was extinguished and the family lay in the fitful quiet, the scratching would begin. A faint, persistent sound of tiny claws scrabbling against the rough clay of the wall, or, worse, a deliberate, rhythmic gnawing sound coming directly from the area of the grain storage. You would sit up, heart pounding, listening intently, knowing that every single moment of that sound represented calories being irreversibly stolen. The primary culprits were the house mice and, more terrifyingly, the large, aggressive black rats that thrived on the city's endless filth. These creatures, fast and highly intelligent, would find any weakness in the defense: a subtle crack in the ceramic jar, a seam coming loose in the leather sack, or simply the gap between the lid and the rim, and exploit it with ruthless efficiency. The next morning, the visible evidence of their attack was devastating. Small, dark piles of droppings scattered near the storage area, tiny teeth marks scored into the hard wood of a chest, and, most crushingly, an unmistakable hole chewed through the thick sack, exposing the precious yellow-brown grains. The rodent's presence meant more than just the loss of volume. It meant contamination. The grain, tainted by urine and feces, became a vehicle for the same lethal diseases that were endemic in the cesspits, transforming the very food meant to sustain life into a potential source of typhoid or plague. The psychological toll of finding this contamination was immense, forcing the difficult, stomach-churning decision of whether to throw away the affected portion, a catastrophic economic loss, or to risk the health of the family by consuming the compromised goods. The microscopic enemies were equally ruinous. Even perfectly stored grain was constantly under threat from weevils and other storage beetles whose eggs, often laid in the wheat field itself, would hatch in the warmth of the jar. These insects did not consume the grain so much as they hollowed it out, leaving behind a fine, worthless dust. The ultimate, humiliating proof of their presence would come at the dinner ritual, when the flatbreads were baked. Sometimes, when chewing the bread, there would be a sudden, brief, sickening crunch. The sound of an insect baked into the flour. This was an inescapable sign that the infestation was deep and widespread, and that the food, while still edible, was deeply compromised. The defenses were crude and often failed. You would use simple snap traps or flat, heavy stones to crush the rodents, but the reproduction rate was too high for a total victory. Sometimes, dried herbs, like mint or fennel, were mixed into the grain, hoping to repel the insects, or the entire store would be carried outside on a hot day and spread thinly, hoping the sun would drive the weevils away. But these were temporary reprieves in a war of attrition. The continuous loss, a small handful of grain gone today, a few ounces ruined tomorrow, was a slow, agonizing bleed of the family's wealth and confidence. It was a constant, gnawing anxiety that kept you mentally accounting for the losses, trying to stretch the dwindling supply, and fearing the inevitable day when the barrel was truly empty. The psychological pressure of watching your future security disappear, not in a single, catastrophic event, but in the tiny, persistent mouths of creatures you could not control, compounded the chronic exhaustion of the day. The necessity of defending the food supply was just one aspect of the endless labor required to maintain the fragile infrastructure of the ancient home. The world demanded that the head of the household be not just a scavenger and a laborer, but a builder, a repairman, and a craftsman all rolled into one, a burden that few could truly bear. The fundamental insecurity of life in ancient Jerusalem was magnified by the expectation that the head of the household was not a specialist, but a mandatory jack of all trades, required to possess a taxing, if basic, competency in a dozen different crafts. Unlike the wealthy Roman citizen who could hire a specialized Faber craftsman for every task, the working class man could not afford to pay for specialized labor. Every repair, every structural patch, and every piece of maintenance, from carpentry to simple masonry to minor farming, fell squarely upon your shoulders, often requiring you to perform tasks for which you possessed neither the skill, the time, nor the proper tools. This constant demand for multifaceted, inexpert labor added a profound layer of physical and mental strain to an already brutal existence. The home itself, being constructed of ephemeral mud brick, was in a state of perpetual, slow decay, demanding the skills of a novice mason almost weekly. A sudden winter downpour might create a large crack in the wall, or a stone at the corner of the doorway might shift, requiring immediate, frantic intervention to prevent structural collapse. The tools at your disposal were primitive and heavy: a crudely fashioned trowel, perhaps a bucket, and your own strong hands. The process involved mixing fresh mud, straw, and water, a messy, physically demanding task, and then applying the new, rough mixture to the wall, hoping that it would bond correctly with the old, dried clay. The work was always hurried and unskilled. You were patching, not building, and the resulting repair was usually uneven, weak, and visually jarring, a testament to the fact that you were not a mason, but a desperate man trying to secure his family's roof. The carpentry demands were equally frustrating. Wooden objects were expensive and scarce. The few chairs, the single storage chest, the heavy door, or a broken roof beam. When a piece of furniture broke or a door hinge warped, the task of repair required a different, equally specialized skill set that you lacked. Your tools were basic: a heavy, blunt iron hammer, a simple, non-adjustable saw, and perhaps an adze, a powerful, heavy cutting tool designed for shaping wood, not for fine repair. Trying to fix a complex joint with these crude instruments was an exercise in frustration, resulting in splintered wood, ill-fitting components, and a final product that was functional but ugly, its structural integrity always questionable. You would spend precious hours, time taken away from earning the necessary day's wage, hunched over a broken stool or a cracked beam, sweating under the pressure of having to restore an expensive piece of property that could not be easily replaced. Beyond the repairs to the dwelling, the necessary labor often extended to agriculture. Even if your primary profession was stone hauling or selling goods, you likely maintained a small patch of arid land outside the city walls or tended a few grapevines in a communal plot, demanding the skills of a subsistence farmer. This involved knowing when to plant the winter wheat, how to prune the vine to encourage fruit, and the backbreaking labor of turning the rocky, unforgiving Judean soil with a simple, inefficient plow or a heavy, short-handled hoe. This cyclical labor, planting, weeding, and harvesting, required immense physical exertion in the unforgiving sun, all while knowing that the primary responsibility of earning money in the city still loomed. The true drain of this generalized labor was the chronic physical pain it engendered. The short-handled tools forced unnatural bending and twisting, ensuring that the existing aches in your back and knees were constantly aggravated. The inexpert use of the heavy hammer or the sharp adze often resulted in strained muscles, cuts, and deep bruises that healed slowly and hindered your ability to perform your primary, paid work. The body became a collection of chronically inflamed joints and muscles, a living testament to the fact that it was forced to do the work of 10 specialized men, using the tools of none. You were a perpetual amateur, forced to take on professional responsibilities, living with the poor quality of your own craftsmanship and the knowledge that your crude repairs were only temporary fixes against the constant decay of the ancient world. Having endured the endless physical demands of being an inexpert craftsman and laborer, the mind was always forced back to the overarching, unpredictable reality that overshadowed all domestic and economic concerns. The entire fragile structure of your life, the patched home, the repaired tools, the small pile of grain, was built upon ground that could shift violently and without warning, due to the constant underlying threat of political and military upheaval in a highly volatile region. The patched walls, the stored grain, and the weary body were all secondary concerns when measured against the immediate, unpredictable danger posed by the political volatility of the city. To live in ancient Jerusalem under the Roman occupation was to live with the perpetual sensation of walking across a floor, paved with shattered glass, knowing that any small shift in pressure, any misstep by yourself or your neighbor, could trigger a catastrophic, bloody collapse. This simmering political tension, the deep spiritual hatred between the foreign Roman occupiers and the fervent nationalist Jewish populace, especially those who called themselves the Zealots, created a state of constant high-alert anxiety that was more draining than any physical labor. The true threat to survival was never starvation alone, but the swift, merciless violence of a spontaneous riot or a subsequent brutal Roman reprisal. The Zealots, who represented the most extreme, uncompromising rejection of foreign rule, were always the spark, the tiny flame that could ignite the crowded city into a bonfire of death. They moved through the narrow alleyways with a fierce, quiet intensity, recognized by their distinct mannerisms, their deep commitment to the law, and their willingness to wield the sika, the short, curved dagger they concealed beneath their cloaks. Their presence in a section of the market was never a welcome sight. It meant that you were now operating in a zone of high risk. You knew that at any moment, a dispute over a perceived slight, a shouted political slogan, or the sudden, deliberate murder of a Roman sympathizer, a collaborator, could erupt, turning a busy thoroughfare into a trap. The most terrifying aspect of these sudden outbreaks was their complete randomness. You might be haggling over the price of oil, your mind completely focused on the small economic struggle, when the sound of a shattering ceramic pot or a sharp, inhuman scream would cut through the market noise. In that instant, every person in the market would freeze, the air suddenly thick and cold as the ears strained to decipher the source of the sound. Was it a thief? Was it a simple accident? Or had the zealots struck? Within seconds, panic would spread like a physical contagion, not through sight, but through the sudden, coordinated sound of running feet. Men, women, and children would suddenly be sprinting, pushing and shoving to escape the invisible center of the chaos. In these moments, your own safety was entirely determined by two factors: proximity and luck. If you were close to the exit of the market or near a shop deep enough to offer momentary sanctuary, you might be spared the worst. But if you were caught in the middle, or directly in the zealots' path as they retreated, you became collateral damage, trampled by the fleeing crowd, or mistaken for an enemy in the confusion. The rule was immediate, total self-preservation. Abandon your goods, abandon your stall, and find an dark doorway, an abandoned barrel, or a heap of refuse to hide behind, making yourself as small and invisible as possible. The initial zealot strike was terrifying, but the Roman reprisal was often far more deadly and indiscriminate. The Romans, highly trained and professionally merciless, did not bother to distinguish between a zealot fighter and a market vendor who merely happened to be in the wrong place. Their response to a disturbance was immediate, overwhelming force designed not just to suppress the riot, but to instill a lasting, debilitating terror in the populace. The sound of their segmented iron armor rattling as they ran, the sharp, authoritative bark of their centurions' commands in Latin, and the sickening thud of their clubs, or the glint of their gladius swords, were signals of impending slaughter. A Roman search was a terror of a different kind, often conducted randomly, particularly in the lower, poorer quarters of the city where zealots were suspected of hiding. A squad of Roman soldiers, armored and angry, would seal off an entire alleyway, moving house to house, kicking down doors, and tearing apart the meager belongings of the residents. Their searches were not investigations. They were deliberate acts of psychological dominance. They would overturn the food barrels, shatter the ceramics, and interrogate anyone present. The slightest hesitation or perceived insolence treated as an act of rebellion. The risk was simple. If a discarded knife, a piece of anti-Roman propaganda, or simply a look of defiance was found, the consequence was immediate arrest, beating, or summary execution, with no trial and no appeal. During such searches, the deepest act of bravery was often to stand silently, eyes lowered, absorbing the humiliation while calculating the risks of every breath, knowing that your life depended on the mood of an anonymous, heavily armed Roman soldier who saw you as nothing more than an insect to be crushed. This political tension created an atmosphere where every interaction with a stranger was judged through a lens of suspicion. Was the man next to you a zealot? Was he a Roman spy? Was the conversation you just overheard safe to repeat? This ceaseless calculation, the low, continuous hum of fear that underlay every daily action, was the heaviest burden of the occupation, stealing the mind's ability to focus on the essential tasks of survival, always demanding a portion of your awareness be dedicated to the silent, invisible warfare that could erupt at any moment. This necessary vigilance, driven by the fear of local political violence, contrasted sharply with the profound darkness that surrounded the world beyond the city walls, where information and people moved at a dangerous, agonizing crawl. The intense, localized danger posed by zealots and Romans was the daily backdrop of life. But the deeper, wider world was often a place of agonizing uncertainty, defined by the slow, unreliable, and dangerous process of communication. In an age before codified, official news, your reliance on information was total. Yet the information itself was perpetually warped by the slow-moving, unreliable process of word of mouth. The reality of any event, a major crop failure in Galilee, a political shift in Rome, or the movement of a large military garrison, was always filtered through countless mouths, acquiring layers of rumor, exaggeration, and outright falsehood by the time it reached the busy, waiting ears of Jerusalem. Anxiety was born not just from danger, but from this chronic uncertainty. News of significance, a tax increase, a new decree from the Roman governor in Caesarea, or a drought in the wheat-producing regions, might take days or even weeks to arrive. When it finally did, it usually appeared in the market square as a fragmented, contradictory mosaic of gossip. A merchant, newly arrived from the coast, might share a breathless account of a ship sinking, while a beggar who had walked the road from Hebron might claim to have seen a massive Roman legion moving north. These competing claims would be intensely debated, picked apart, and reassembled by the listening crowd, each man attempting to discern the single thread of truth that might affect his meager future. You would stand on the edge of these gatherings, trying to filter the noise, knowing that a single piece of reliable information, like which commodity was about to become scarce, or which road was currently unsafe, could be the difference between a slight profit and a catastrophic loss. The physical reality of the road itself underscored this difficulty in communication. Travel was an arduous, slow, and inherently dangerous process, reserved only for necessity. The journey between even closely linked towns like Jericho or Bethlehem was not a comfortable passage, but a physical ordeal. It required waking before the first light to harness the donkey, or simply to begin the long, exhausting walk on foot. The roads were often rough, unpaved tracks, covered in sharp stones or deep, choking dust in the summer, or turned into slick, dangerous clay paths during the brief, torrential rains of winter. Every mile was a conscious effort, draining the body's already depleted reserves of energy. The difficulty of the terrain was compounded by the psychological fear of brigands. The Roman army only maintained patrols on the most vital routes connecting major urban centers, leaving the vast majority of the secondary roads and wilderness areas unpoliced. These zones were the hunting ground of thieves and brigands, men who had been driven to desperation by the same poverty and political upheaval that defined your own life. These men saw a solitary traveler, a small convoy of goods, or a merchant carrying a modest sum of coinage as an easy target. The fear was always present. The sudden sound of horses, the sight of figures moving too quickly among the barren hillsides, or the discovery of a fresh corpse by the side of the road, left as a grim warning. To travel meant preparing for the worst. You would carry only the bare minimum of goods, and if you carried money, it would be hidden in multiple, inconspicuous places, sewn into the lining of your cloak, tied beneath the sole of your sandal, or concealed within a seemingly worthless, cracked ceramic vessel. A prayer would be offered before leaving the city gate, not just for a safe journey, but for an invisible journey, hoping to pass through the dangerous landscape unnoticed. The physical exhaustion upon arriving in the next town was total. Your feet blistered, your throat parched, and your body aching from the strain of carrying even a small load. Yet, the work was only half done, as the return journey and its associated risk lay ahead. This isolation, the agonizing slowness of information, and the physical barrier of dangerous travel meant that your world remained stubbornly small, centered on the immediate, tangible reality of Jerusalem and its near environs. The constant stream of rumors and the undeniable difficulty of movement contributed to a persistent feeling of being hemmed in, limited by forces you could not see or control, yet which determined the price of wheat and the timing of the next oppressive decree. The external world was a powerful, dark abstraction, the fear of which was as real as the heat of the noon sun. Returning to the tight, contained world of the city, the focus narrowed from the vast, abstract dangers of the road to the most intimate, tangible reality of poverty. The threadbare fabric that clung to your own skin. The outward manifestation of this life of constant struggle was the single set of clothes you possessed, a truth that carried not just physical discomfort, but a deep, inescapable social shame. For a man of working class means, ownership was defined by an absolute minimum, typically a simple linen or coarse wool tunic that reached to the knee, and perhaps a heavier, darker woolen cloak, the himation, used for warmth at night and for covering the head and shoulders in public. This single tunic was the entirety of your wardrobe, the only barrier between your skin and the chaotic, filthy world and its condition was a visible public ledger of your poverty. The practical difficulty of owning only one garment was immediate and brutal: the matter of cleanliness. Since you had no replacement to wear, washing the tunic was a rare, necessary, and complex ritual that could only occur at night, when the day's work was done and the body was already exhausted. Water was scarce, precious, and often contaminated. The washing process itself required carrying the heavy, soiled garment to a public fountain, or more likely, reusing the household's limited, already dirty water supply. The cleaning agent was not soap as we know it, but a harsh lye made from mixing animal fat with wood ash, a caustic substance that was aggressive on the fabric and abrasive on the hands. The process took hours. The tunic would be soaked, scrubbed violently against a rough stone or wooden board, beaten to dislodge the deep-set grime, and then rinsed repeatedly in the cold water. The cleaning was never complete. It was simply a reduction of the dirt. Then came the agonizing wait for it to dry. The wet tunic would be hung over a rope or draped over a bush in the courtyard, and you would lie on your sleeping mat, wrapped only in your heavy, rough cloak, shivering in the damp night air, hoping that the fabric would be dry enough to wear by the time the dawn broke. If it rained, or if the air was too damp, you would be forced to dress in the morning in a tunic that was still cold and clammy, a profound misery that clung to the skin all day. The result of this constant, hard usage and aggressive washing was inevitable wear and tear. The coarse wool quickly became matted and stiff, losing any soft texture it might have once possessed. The fabric suffered from deep, permanent stains: mud, animal blood from the market, oil, and the sweat that soaked through the fiber on a daily basis. These stains were not just cosmetic imperfections, they were the visible record of your low-status labor. More critically, the edges of the tunic, the hem, the neck opening, and the cuffs quickly became frayed, separating into long, visible threads. This fraying was the hallmark of the truly poor, the undeniable marker of a life without surplus. The social embarrassment this caused was subtle but persistent. While everyone wore simple garments, the quality and condition of the fabric were the silent communicators of one's standing. A wealthy man's tunic would be made of finely woven, perhaps dyed linen, clean and smooth. Yours was heavy, stained, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and unwashed wool. In the public space, this smell and the sight of the ragged edges served as a constant reminder of your precarious position. The need to conserve the single garment meant that you could not risk damaging it further by engaging in particularly rough labor. Every tear had to be immediately and crudely stitched with coarse thread, the uneven line of the repair merely drawing more attention to the garment's exhausted state. You wore this single tunic through every season, in the sweltering heat of the summer, where the heavy wool trapped the heat and the sweat, and in the cold, damp winter, where the thin fabric offered almost no insulation. It was not a choice of fashion or comfort. It was the simple, hard necessity of scarcity. The tunic was not a piece of clothing. It was a shell of survival, battered, stained, and clinging to your skin. A continuous physical burden that you could only briefly shed during the agony of a rare, cold wash. It was the physical manifestation of a life perpetually on the edge, a life demanding constant exhausting vigilance. Finally, as the last light faded from the sky and the city's nocturnal clamor began to rise once more, the relentless demand on the body came to its overdue end, bringing a moment of painful yet profound relief. The final, exquisite moment of the long day was the surrender to utter, complete physical exhaustion. As the last embers of the fire died down and the rough sound of the city's contained life began its nightly drone, you would finally shed the heavy woolen cloak and the single, sweat-dampened tunic, lying down upon the coarse, familiar straw mat that was your bed. This act of lying down was not merely a transition to rest. It was a profound bodily release. The heavy sigh of muscles that had been forced to bear impossible loads since before dawn. The fatigue was a total physical reality, not a simple feeling, but a crushing weight that pressed you into the floor. Every bone in the body seemed to ache with a dull, insistent throbbing. Your back, perpetually curved over the plow, the heavy burden, or the crude repair work, felt brittle and inflexible. Your hands, the instruments of your survival, were raw, calloused, and stiff. The small cuts and bruises from the day's work burning with a dull irritation beneath the rough calluses. Your feet, swollen and tender from traversing the rough, stone-paved alleys and the sharp, dusty roads, pulsed with a relentless, weary pain. You would lie flat, stretching each limb slightly, searching for the single position that offered the most temporary relief, knowing that no position could fully erase the cumulative physical toll of years of hard labor. Yet, despite the discomfort, despite the roughness of the straw that inevitably poked the skin, the hardness of the packed earth beneath the mat, and the low, continuous battle against the restless fleas and the distant noises of the street, there was a profound, desperate relief in this moment of physical cessation. To simply lie still, to stop the continuous, demanding motion that had defined every moment since waking, was a temporary victory. It was a time when the mind, too weary to run its usual calculations of risk, cost, and scarcity, began to dim its internal lamp. The final thoughts before sleep claimed you were rarely grand or reflective. They were simple, immediate assessments. The deep, satisfying ache in the shoulder from hauling the stone, the memory of the few small coins earned that day, and the necessary task that had been left unfinished. The mind would cling briefly to a single, small comfort. The faint, lingering smell of the lentils cooked over the fire, the brief, shared warmth of the family lying close together, or the simple knowledge that, for this one day, you had survived, you had worked, and you had not succumbed to famine, disease, or the Roman sword. As the heavy curtain of exhaustion finally drew across your consciousness, the brief, fitful hours of rest would begin. A fragile, contested truce with the demands of the world. You would sink into a shallow sleep, ready to be pulled back to awareness by the sudden bray of a donkey or the frantic scratch of a rodent, never quite achieving the deep, restorative oblivion of true rest. But the most certain knowledge of the night was this, that the sun would rise again. Despite the exhaustion, despite the fear, despite the endless, frustrating labor, the cycle was absolute. You had survived the day, and you would inevitably wake, heart immediately beginning its heavy, rhythmic beat of anxiety, driven by the absolute necessity of rising, dressing in the cold, rough tunic, and stepping back out into the noise, the hunger, and the constant demanding hazards of life in ancient Jerusalem. The day ahead would be just as hard, just as long, and just as precarious as the one that had passed. But the instinct for survival, the deep animal necessity to provide for your own, would compel you to rise once more and face the unyielding dawn.